I've always found it interesting to consider historically how Jesus became a god. And there's particularly interesting work by two Yale professors, King and Messiah as Son of God, Divine, Human, and Angelic Messianic Figures in Biblical and Related Literature. This is an academic book written by scholars, obviously, for scholars and students of the New Testament. But they, these two Yale professors describe the process, the historical process by which Jesus became a god. I just wanted to read a couple of paragraphs from a chapter. I'll just read the text. It is in academic language, and then I'll make some interpretive comments on it and try and unpack what they are saying. So bear with me as I read the text, and then hopefully I'll make it clearer what I think they're getting at. I'm reading from a page 174, and the subheading here is the issue of worship. One of the key questions, they say, in the debate about the divinity of Jesus has been whether he is worshipped in a way that principal agents of God are not. It is difficult to distinguish ancient texts and practices expressing political submission and respect on the one hand, from practices that we would call religious, which express worship and devotion on the other. If Jesus was seen as taking over God's functions as king, warrior, and judge at the end, with a capital E, as God's agent, his divinity may have been perceived primarily in functional terms at first. But the idea of a heavenly Messiah opens the door to speculation and rhetoric about pre-existence. The notion of pre-existence intensifies the divine status of the heavenly Messiah. Similarly, the honorific recognition as God's Son is intensified in language about a virginal conception. The cultural environment must also be taken into account. In the Hellenistic ruler cults, and especially in the imperial cults, men who were once human beings were honoured and worshipped as gods. Some were even worshipped as gods during their earthly lifetimes. The Messiah of Israel was conceived at first primarily as a king, of his own nation first of all, and then of the whole world. The understanding of Jesus that emerged after his resurrection involved his kingship over Israel and over the entire world. Given the practices of imperial cults, it is not surprising that Jesus was viewed as a god, and that worship of him became an alternative to the worship of the emperor. End quote. So that's quite a tightly packed academic bit of analysis there. Going back to the first paragraph, one of the key questions about the divinity of Jesus has been whether he is worshipped in a way that principal agents of God are not. So in other words, is there something special about the divinity of the worship of Jesus that is unique and quite different from the way that other agents of God were worshipped in a secondary sense, not in the worship given to the one true God? And they talk about the difficulty of distinguishing in ancient texts and their practices the differences between the political submission and respect on the one hand that's given to, say, a ruler, and on the other, what we would call now religious worship. Now, there's a footnote here, and this is where it goes into the Greek. The use of the verb proskuneo, in the book of Revelation, with God and the Lamb as objects, proskuneo is sometimes translated as worship. So in the book of Revelation, God and the Lamb, meaning Jesus, are objects of worship. And then the same word is used with the community in Philadelphia, also as the object of proskuneo in chapter 3, verse 9, is a case in point, they say. So the word, the verb proskuneo, to worship, can have a political meaning, even to the community in Philadelphia in Revelation 3:9, as well as be used in a more religious sense of worship. So Then they talk about how Jesus was first the king of Israel. This is after the ascension of Jesus, and then how his kingship was extended globally later on. But what I find particularly interesting in this paragraph is the penultimate paragraph. It says the cultural environment must also be taken into account when we discuss the issue of worship. Was Jesus worshipped as God? And he talks about they talk about the Hellenistic ruler cults. These are the ruler cults in the Greco-Roman world, particularly the imperial cults to do with the Roman emperor himself, where men, emperors who were once human beings, were honoured subsequently and worshipped as God. Sometimes at their death, the Senate would, in an honorific way, say that they are now divine. But some were worshipped as gods even during their own lifetimes. And they say the Messiah of Israel, Jesus, was conceived at first primarily as a king of his own nation, Israel, and then of the whole world. And they say that the understanding of Jesus that emerged in the church after his resurrection and ascension, given the practices of the imperial Roman cults, it's not surprising that as the gospel spread outside of Israel into the Greco-Roman world, mainly through the preaching of Paul, of course, and the Hellenistic Christians, that Jesus, not surprising that Jesus also came to be viewed as a god, and that worship was given to him as an alternative to the worship of the emperor. So this is how they say it's important that we look at the historical and cultural environment in the development of the worship of Jesus as a god in the first century. There's a fascinating little footnote here in the next chapter, chapter 8, when the authors of this book are talking about how to translate John 1:1, the third clause of John 1:1. This is John's Gospel, chapter 1, verse 1. And the Word was God. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, is the traditional Christian translation. They say John 1:1 may be translated either the Word was God or the Word was a God. The Word was a God. And then the footnote here talks about someone, B.A. Mastin, considers it overwhelmingly probable that John 1:1 describes the pre-existent Logos as God in a particular work. This conclusion, though, they say, however, is based on his view that Thomas's acclamation in John 20:28, where you remember where Thomas acclaims Jesus, "My Lord and my God." Yeah, an extraordinary statement. So they say that Thomas's acclamation in 20:28 is the one verse in the New Testament which does unquestionably describe Christ as God. But they criticize this view. This view fails to recognize, however, that the phrase Dominus et Deus, and presumably its Greek equivalent, is an honorific exclamation, used, for example, by those who wish to flatter Domitian. Domitian is the Roman emperor. So what are they saying here? That they're saying, "My Lord and my God." That they're saying that John, at the end of the first century, is calling, has Thomas acclaim to Jesus, "My Lord and my God," which in Latin is Dominus et Deus. This is an honorific acclamation known to have been used by those at that time, in the end of the first century, who wished to flatter Domitian. Domitian was a Roman emperor, of course. So what John is doing, he's saying, no, Jesus is the Lord and God, not the Roman emperor. So, but of course, the Roman emperor wasn't really the absolute one high God of the universe. He wasn't Yahweh. He wasn't the originator. No one thought that he was Zeus in an absolute sense. It was an honorific title. It was given to flatter him, flatter the Roman emperor. "Oh, you're so marvelous. You are the king. You are the Lord and God." But they didn't really think that he was Zeus or Yahweh. In the same way, on the lips of Thomas, Thomas is saying in effect, no, Jesus is Dominus et Deus, not the Roman emperor. So in a similar way, we shouldn't take these words in the strongest sense of actually asserting that Jesus is Yahweh. No, that's not quite what's going on here. It's the Greek gospel equivalent of a title that was known to be used to flatter the Roman emperor. And that's what the gospel writer is using that term to make his own point. That kind of makes sense. Um, so I think these two writers, I'll just perhaps say a bit more about them. One is Adela Collins, professor of New Testament criticism interpretation at Yale University. The other is John J. Collins, professor of Old Testament criticism interpretation at Yale University. I get the impression they are a married couple. What an extraordinary marriage. One is a professor in the New Testament, the other is a professor in the Old Testament, both at Yale. And they both co-authored this. So the chapters to do with the Old Testament written by one person and the New Testament by the other person in the marriage, so to speak. But these are world-class experts, and they clearly see the issue of worship. We need to take into the cultural environment, take that into account when we understand why Gentile Christians ultimately came to worship Jesus as God, as a counterpoint, as a way of saying, no, we're not going to worship the emperor, we're going to worship Jesus. He is our king. But of course, this is a later development. It's not something that we find in the earliest Jesus tradition. The evidence suggests that wasn't present at all. So as they say in the last sentence, given the practice of the imperial cults, the Roman imperial cults, it's not surprising that Jesus was viewed as a god and that worship of him became an alternative to the worship of the Roman emperor. So that's their insight. I think that's quite an astute comment. And yeah, what do you think? Till next time.